Good afternoon and welcome to our conference delegates in person and online to this session, Unlocking Key Worker Housing Affordability. Thank you to conference partner Homes Victoria for supporting the National Housing Conference. My name is Dr. Gina Zappia and I am the Research Program Manager at AHURI, and I am delighted to be facilitating this session. I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present. Today's session is being streamed, and again I'd like to welcome delegates watching from around Australia and some from overseas. The session is being recorded and will be available in the coming days to all delegates through the conference portal. A bit of admin: you need to use the conference app to pose questions. So I hope everyone has the conference app downloaded, and the Q&A live stream is in that app for you in this session. We won't be taking verbal questions from the audience. We will actually be doing a very short Q&A at each end of presentation. So you'll find there'll be a lovely 10-minute space to pepper me with those questions that I can engage our lovely panel with today. So don't be shy. The pandemic has highlighted the essential nature of key workers and the affordability and commuting challenges they face in our major cities. In this session, we will explore some of the opportunities and solutions to improve housing affordability for key workers in Australia. And on that note, I would like to introduce our three presenters. We have Dr. Catherine Gilbert, who is a postdoctoral research associate in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. Chris Smith, CEO, Foundation Housing. Chris is joining us virtually today, and we welcome him. We'll see him soon. And Tim Buskins, CEO of Hope Housing Fund. If you'd like to know more detail about our presenters today, just pop into the speakers section of the session in the app or online. So on that note, I would like to offer Catherine the microphone.
Thank you. So I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, as well as those of the lands on which this research I'm going to share today was conducted, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So what I want to do in the time I have today is really present the evidence base for why key workers need interventions around housing in our major cities. Can someone move the slide on? Oh, thanks. So I'm going to draw on the findings of this AHURI scoping study, which was undertaken with my colleagues, Dr. Zara Nasreen and Professor Nicole Gurin. And what I want to do is I want to first talk about really what a key worker is and what the rationale is for policy intervention to support key workers' access to housing. And then I'll share some of the results of this original analysis that we undertook. So it's a very data-rich report. I'm just going to touch on some of the key findings. So if you're interested, I encourage you to have a look at the report, or you can get in contact with me. And then what I'll do is I'll talk about what we heard from some of the key worker industry experts who we spoke to about really what the implications of all of this is for our cities. Whoops. Okay, right. So when we looked through the policy and the academic literature, what was really clear is that there is no universal definition of what a key worker is. There isn't even consistent terminology, so we often see essential service worker or frontline service worker used to mean the same thing. So really the term refers to people who perform essential public services but who earn low and moderate incomes. And the traditional or core definition referred to people in the industries usually of healthcare, policing, emergency services, even public transport. But for the purpose of constructing policies and programs, definitions vary very widely. So sometimes they include paraprofessionals and support staff within those traditional core industries. They can also extend to the broader public sector. Sometimes they include jobs that are seen as important for local economies, whether they be in retail or tourism or hospitality, jobs that support the broader labor market, so for example in childcare. And what we've seen in the context of the COVID pandemic is that there's been renewed debate on what really constitutes a key worker. And so we've seen the emergence of ideas like essential retail workers, people who work in essential food services, and we've also seen people like delivery drivers be considered to be sort of essential workers. Right. So what we found is there's really a threefold rationale for supporting key workers to access appropriate and affordable housing. And so the first thing that's important to understand is, well, we've seen over the course of the pandemic a shift towards alternate forms of working, people working from home. It still very much matters where key workers live because their jobs require physical presence. There isn't an opportunity for them, for the most part, to be performed remotely. So where key workers live really, really matters relative to their jobs. And particularly in certain sectors, it's important that key workers are able to be on call. So they need to really live within a 20-minute radius of where they work so that they can respond quickly to spikes in service demand or to emergency situations. Second is that there is evidence that inadequate housing opportunities are strongly linked to recruitment and retention problems within these industries. And that's not just that's internationally. So unaffordable housing, long commutes, those are reasons for people to either exit their profession or, due to the population serving nature of these jobs, to seek employment in other population centers that may be more affordable. And finally, of course, the final rationale is, of course, there's the wider public benefit of having very well-functioning, high-quality public services. And we've seen this to be particularly true in the COVID pandemic. So we've seen that a lot of workers play a really critical role in cities' ability to respond to the increasingly prevalent crisis events that we're witnessing. But we've also seen that there are public health and safety risks if key workers are either inadequately housed, for example, in overcrowded housing, or they're commuting vast distances across the city to get to their work. So what I want to do for the remainder of the time is really focus on the evidence we uncovered in the context of our scoping study about the housing situation of key workers in Sydney and in Melbourne. So these are the occupation groups we focused on. We took a very broad view of what a key worker is, encapsulating both those traditional definitions, but also people employed in other sectors that are sort of emerging under the key worker definition. So we were somewhat limited to the census four-digit occupation categories. So this list certainly is not exhaustive. But all the occupations in this group typically earn incomes from the second quintile to about the mid-third quintile of the income range for their respective regions. So they really are low and moderate income earners. Okay, so what we did to begin with is we just did a very, very high-level analysis to look at the geographic patterns of housing affordability. So we used incomes derived from industry award scales, and in some cases we also used evidence from Seek, the job seeker site. And what we did was we used those to calculate an affordable rent or an affordable mortgage repayment using the 30% rule so that the payment should not exceed 30% of income. And then what we did was we compared that to the actual medians for different property types. And what we found is, particularly for workers who are in that Q2 income range, there were really no local government areas within either metropolitan region that had an affordable median unit or housing price. And even if you get up into the Q3 range, so that this map's actually showing an early career registered nurse or an indicative salary for an early career registered nurse, options are really, really limited to the outer suburbs. And it's important to note, I think, that it's actually not just a central city problem. So there are some, areas, satellite cities and coastal regional areas that are affected too. Whoops. So a similar pattern actually with rental affordability as well. So the map here is just showing affordability based on indicative salary for a childcare worker. So you can see that there are very few options available within the inner subregions. And again, it's not a problem that's just confined to the city centers. We also looked at the availability of affordably priced rental properties for an indicative month, and we found, of course, that availability is also a problem. And then what we heard when we spoke to key worker industry representatives was that, often it's not just the affordability, it's the availability and also the challenge of potentially having to find accommodation quite quickly when, for example, receiving a first assignment or a first job. So then what we did was we looked at the census data. So the last census data we have is for 2016, so we're eagerly awaiting the 2021 census data to find out what's happened in this space. But what we found from the 2016 census data is that key worker jobs are dispersed across the metropolitan regions, but there still is a significant concentration in inner subregions. So about a third of those jobs are still concentrated within the inner subregions of both metropolitan regions. But compared to the distribution of the general labor force, so where people live generally, key workers are much more heavily concentrated in outer suburbs and satellite cities and very underrepresented within inner subregions. We also found that the key workers that in the sample we looked at, they're more likely than the labor force generally to commute over 30 kilometers to work. And they predominantly do so by private car, which may have to do with having to work shifts at antisocial hours, as well as the dispersed nature of some key worker jobs. And employment self-containment is very, very low in the inner subregions. So it's quite high when you go out into satellite cities and outer suburbs, but very low in the inner city. We also found evidence that there are quite a number of key workers who are commuting from outside the metropolitan regions, from places like Geelong, the Illawarra, the Blue Mountains, into the city centre. We were quite surprised to find very high incidences of housing stress. So we're defining this, again, as households spending more than 30% of their gross income on their housing costs. So what our research showed, this is based on the last census, was that 20% of the key workers we looked at in Sydney are in households who are experiencing housing stress. That's even higher if you look just at key workers who are in the private rental sector. And in Melbourne, it's about 17%. And as you can see, it's more prevalent among lower paid occupations and those residing in expensive inner subregions. So if you look at the table, you can see that for some occupation groups residing in those inner subregions, almost half of the key workers captured in the census were experiencing housing stress. We also found relatively high incidences of unsuitable housing. So this is based on the Canadian National Occupancy Standard. So what we found was that 31,000 key workers in Greater Sydney, 18,000 in Greater Melbourne are in households that can be classified as overcrowded. Now, again, the prevalence is much higher amongst lower paid occupation groups and those living in the inner subregions. But we were surprised to find that there are significant numbers of key workers in that third income quintile range, like teachers and registered nurses, who are also in overcrowded households. Then what we did was we compared where key workers reported living in the 2011 census versus where they reported living in 2016. And what we found is that there has been a net loss of key worker residents in the more expensive inner subregions, and there have been net gains in satellite cities and some more affordable outer subregions. So there's always been, I suppose, a churn of younger people coming into the city to work, to gain work experience, and then moving out when they enter that household formation stage. But what we found in net terms is that there's actually been a net loss, so those workers aren't being replaced. I think it's just important to note that our analysis was conducted in 2019, so I looked just briefly with the data I had to try to update this. The affordability situation for purchase, of course, has worsened. There are fewer local government areas that have a median price that's affordable to the key workers in our study. What we found in terms of the rental market is actually for most key workers, particularly those earning incomes in the Q2 range, so the lower income key workers, they actually have fewer affordable local government areas because the areas that were affordable when we first undertook the research were in those outer suburbs and satellite city locations, and that's where there has been generally a rise in rents. So there has been a slight drop in medians in some inner suburbs, and that has helped the higher income key workers to theoretically, potentially access more suburbs, but it hasn't been enough to make it affordable to those earning Q2 incomes. So in terms of trying to understand what this actually means for cities, what we heard when we spoke to industry representatives for different key worker occupation groups was that it's really important to understand the unique nature of key worker jobs. So key worker jobs, they have to be performed in person. They're often performed over long shifts during antisocial hours, and they're under high stress situations often where there's a high chance to accrue vicarious trauma. So what we heard from them was that housing stress and insecurity and long commuting is really exacerbating the stress that already is being accrued in the workplace, and that this is having implications for workplace health and safety, for this quality of these key public services, and ultimately for the retention and availability of those more experienced senior key workers. So I think overall, what our research really highlights is that we do have strong empirical evidence that people even earning moderate incomes in the third quintile range are now struggling to afford housing in Australia's most expensive cities. So this is obviously a snapshot. There's definitely a need for more longitudinal data, and there's, I think, a critical need to assess the regional dimension of this as well. But I think it provides a really strong additional rationale to address the spatial mismatch that we're seeing between jobs and affordable housing, not only for the economic productivity of our cities and for social welfare concerns, but actually it's about the functioning of our cities and their health and their safety. So I think it points to a need to increase the supply of affordable housing, of course, but particularly to increase it within what we'd call the intermediate tenures between social housing and market housing in both the rental and the ownership space. And I think the two speakers that follow will talk a bit more about that. So we recognize as well in our report that obviously there's an equity issue here. So selecting particular occupation groups to receive public assistance, potentially it's a difficult political decision. So there is a very clear rationale for why you would support key workers to access appropriate and affordable housing. But what we conclude is there's a potential opportunity for governments to, say, pilot some programs with key worker cohorts, and then potentially to roll those out to moderate income earners more broadly over time. Right, thank you.
Thanks so much, Catherine. I appear to be encumbered by all of my electronic devices, so I'm going to remain seated and introduce our Q&A section. So please feel free to log any of your questions you have for our panel members through the conference app, and we'll present them to our speakers via that app. No, you can stay here. It's up to you. I actually have a question here that's come through, sparked some interest around the interviews that you conducted with the key industry representatives and the workplace stress that you speak of that evidently exacerbates the experience, is exacerbated by the experience of housing stress. Can you talk a little bit more about those findings and that rich data that you would have collected?
Yeah, so we really, one of the reasons we conducted those interviews was to make sure that what we were finding in terms of the quantitative and spatial analysis that we did actually resonated with people who work with key workers on a daily basis. And of course, their responses were, you know, it's complex. Often affordability issues relate to age, to overall household income, to family structure, to whether they're in a dual or single income household. But the trends and the stories that were coming out of our quantitative data very much resonated. And yeah, I mean, what we were told was that there's people who are working often with traumatized groups. There's a lot of mental health implications of working in emergency services or working with traumatized people in very high need situations. And then after a long shift to then commute an hour and a half to potentially or to live in an overcrowded house where you cannot get space, where you cannot get rest, or to be in a precarious housing situation yourself really exacerbates the stress and fatigue that's already accrued. And that can be a reason for people, once they hit a career stage where they're really moving into potentially more leadership positions, choosing to either leave that profession or to, if possible, if they're able to, potentially move to a location where the lifestyle and the affordability is a little bit better.
So it facilitates the loss of those very important employees who have a wealth of experience, intellectual property with them. They move away from the industry, the sector, because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, what we also heard was that often you want the people who are on call to be the people who are the most experienced, right? Who have the most experience, who can respond, candidly to really, really complex situations. And often those people, because they live so far away from where they work, they can't be on call. And it's often very young, early career workers who are living in share housing in the inner cities who are available to be on call. So that can affect the quality of public services.
And on the question of overcrowding, can you remind us again of that measure that was applied?
Yeah, so it's the Canadian National Occupancy Standard. So I mean, it's criticized because it is a very culturally specific measure. But what it basically says is that it sets some rules around who can share a room. And I think I'm trying to remember offhand, but I think children of the same gender can share a room up to the age of 18, but children of different genders, there's an age cutoff of when that's appropriate. Each adult who is not in a couple needs to have their own room. So it sets some standards that are quite culturally determined, but around what is a reasonable extent of room sharing. And so what that suggests is that people may be living in households where two adults who aren't in a relationship may be sharing rooms. There may be 2 or 3 children sharing a room. There may be children of different genders who are more mature sharing a room. So it would capture all of those things. And what we found actually, if you look a little bit deeper into the data, is that, of course, overcrowding is much, much higher amongst people who are living in 2 or 3 family households. And we did uncover quite a few incidences of people living in 2 or 3 family households.
So multiple families sharing, and across those families, there are key workers in...
Yeah, so somebody in the household is a key worker, and they were captured in our sample. So we found that quite a few key workers are living in 2 or 3 family households, and that those households are much more likely to be overcrowded.
I'm not seeing any questions in the conference question app. You're going to get into trouble very soon. So please feel free to pop your questions through, and my colleague will moderate those for me. Otherwise, I'm going to keep asking questions. Oh, there are questions in the app? Oh, I must hit the refresh button. Please excuse me. 2 screens. You think I would be used to this now after 2 years of Zooming constantly? Oh, you're all very fabulous. I apologise. Okay, we have a question here from Michelle. Does your research include analysis of key worker household sizes?
Yes. So we did look at the structure and size of key worker households. I mean, there's about 100 complex data tables behind what the report, and it's not all been included, but we did look at things like the gender profile, where key workers were born. We looked at a lot of other demographic factors, and what we found in terms of the household size is key workers tend to be in households that are larger than the average, and that has to do with the age profile of key workers. So a lot of them are family households with children.
And we have a question from Lee. Did you come across any innovative solutions to addressing affordability for key workers?
Yeah, so I mean, I didn't present this component of the report, but we do also look at some of the examples of internationally of some programs that exist to try to help key workers to access housing, and there's quite a few. I've got a table in the report that gives a summary of the types of initiatives. So there are examples, particularly in the US and in the UK, of programs that extend both the demand and the supply side. So there are examples for example, of developers, both private and affordable housing developers, being able to access very low interest rate loans to develop workforce rental housing that's rented to local workers. There are instances of grants either being offered directly to key workers to support some home purchase costs. There's examples, for example, of key workers being able to access a silent second mortgage to help them purchase a home in different locations. There's also, I think, some examples where governments have provided support for the National Health Service, for example, in the UK, to redevelop its own land for housing, as long as a proportion of that housing is earmarked as affordable housing for essential workers. So what seems to be happening, though, internationally is that there are programs that were initially developed for key workers, but due to the sort of the scale of, I guess, the affordability crisis amongst moderate income workers generally, over time those have evolved to be based not on occupation, but on income level. So they're open much more broadly. So when I said, it's a potential opportunity to pilot some new schemes with key workers and then open those up more broadly over time, that's sort of what has happened in those international jurisdictions.
Thank you. There's some really interesting questions coming through with regard to economic loss and impact on the wider community. So one, is there research that demonstrates costs to wider community because of the lack of key workers in a city or a town?
There isn't A lot. There is a little bit of research that we came across, for example, trying to quantify the benefits of high quality education and what then the effect of not having sort of effective teachers is. So there have been some studies, but nothing I can think of in a more holistic sense. Yeah, I think it'd be really interesting if someone could quantify that.
And with regard to the 2021 census data, I know you mentioned this during our discussions of the session prior to the conference. Will you revisit the research once this data becomes available?
The day it's released, I'll be logging in to have a look. I think it's really important that we capture some more longitudinal data because what we've really got from the last census is a snapshot in time, and it'll be really interesting to see what's happened. I mean, based on the changes in affordability, I would suspect that some of the figures that we've pulled up would have gotten worse over time. I mean, key workers, unlike a lot of workers in the labor force, they've been fully and overemployed during the pandemic. They haven't experienced that income loss, but the housing market has also experienced like crazy inflation. So I would suspect that the situation will be worse, but I'm really excited to look at that.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I think we might give you a little bit of a break now. Fantastic questions.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Yes, please join with me to thank Catherine again. I'd like to welcome Chris Smith virtually into the room. If we could connect with him now.
I'm really sorry, but you can all shift down one seat to the right so that you can be seen on the camera for the screen. No worries, thank you.
Welcome, Chris. Does Chris have connection to our sound? Something.
Are you there?
Oh, thank you, Chris. It's lovely to hear your voice.
Thanks, Gina.
Welcome.
Thank you.
How is it in your part of the world today?
It's not too bad. It's a little bit wet and miserable, but it's we've had some nice weather, so it's a nice change.
Well, we have your PowerPoint slides ready also.
Great. Well, would you like me to start?
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Right. Well, firstly, I'd just like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of Pungalang, which I'm meeting today, which is the Whadjuk people from the Noongar Budja, and pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and also to all Aboriginal people who may be in the room today. Welcome. Okay, great. So this, look, Foundation Housing, we developed Elevate by Foundation Housing back in 2020. We'd been approached by a number of developers over a period of time, over around 5 years, bringing different models to us in relation to how we could develop an affordable portfolio of properties. But they all required us to leverage our portfolio. The capital stacks that were being presented to us were somewhat challenging. And at the time, they were at reasonably high interest rates, and we couldn't get the projects to work financially. And we also had trouble making the projects have tenure. So they were for short periods, and there was no clarity around the type of stock we'd be acquiring and how we would go about managing some of those portfolios. So over time, we worked with our development committee and board on how do we restructure or come up with a more eloquent and simplified model. And in parallel with that, Nifik came along. And with Nifik coming along, it meant that we had access. We had already accessed a facility with Nifik to retire our core debt or change our core debt from NAB to Nifik. So we knew we had a good relationship with them. The state government here had been somewhat static in relation to how it was going to grow the sector. So we repositioned our strategic plan to focus on growing without government support. So working in parallel with Nifik and also with our strategic objectives, we looked at how can we capitalise on a pretty soft market in Perth at the back end of 2019, and we knew at the time there was over 1,000 apartments that were in the market that were still hadn't been sold. So in early 2020, we wrote to the department, we wrote to the housing minister at the time and said we're interested in piloting this model. Is there any support from government to assist us with that? And it's fair to say they came back with, we're excited about what you're looking to do, but at this time there's no interest from the state government to focus on affordable housing. So we, with that, pivoted quite quickly and went to Nifik and said, if we can find, if we can acquire a portfolio of properties and leverage our existing balance sheet, would you be supportive of that? And the Nifik team were very, very proactive in working with us. What we did from there was we went through the 1,000 odd properties and engaged a few consultants to do an environmental scan of where those buildings were, what the condition of those assets was, who the builders were, where the location was, and also the price and the opportunity of leveraging a wholesale transaction to get a discount across that portfolio. And what sort of discounts would those developers be prepared to offer us? We didn't want margin scheme because margin scheme didn't allow us to claw back the GST through our charitable status. So we were quite clear on what we wouldn't do. As the project evolved, it was a really interesting time because the project moved at a fairly rapid pace. We conceptualised the model in January. By March, we were speaking with developers. By June, we were putting in conditional offers to purchase. We still, though, didn't have our Nifik finance locked away. We still didn't have our board approvals, and we still didn't have the consent of the department to proceed with the project. So we were moving at a fairly rapid rate trying to get these properties locked away. And as that was happening, the market pivoted and started to turn. So what became a soft market became a rather heated market from about August, September. So we finally got our relevant approval, the required approval, requisite approvals. We had our contracts locked in, and we started to settle the properties over 4 tranches, with the first one being locked away in January 2021. What was interesting from that period was the first time we, as an organisation, had moved into the affordable housing space. So we rebranded the portfolio Elevate as opposed to foundation housing. So we had a differential between what was our social housing versus our affordable product. The settlement process was harder than we thought. We didn't anticipate settling with 4 or 5 developers at one time, with banks and other interested parties. Because we're a not-for-profit organisation, the stamp duty requirements and land titles are all done manually, so we had to be in the stamps office to have those settled. And we were coordinating a whole range of other stakeholders at that time. So it presented a few challenges for us, and some of the developers also wouldn't allow us access to market properties until they settled. So we'd set a 3-month window to try and mobilise the properties and have them occupied, and not having access to properties or the ability to market until settlement made that somewhat challenging. Having settled the property, having settled the portfolio, though, what we have seen from the project, which having heard Catherine talk what she spoke about just before, it's resonated after having a year of running a program. We have seen firsthand the experiences of making a real positive impact on the people we've housed. So, and we've seen also a corresponding impact on income. So we've got a number of nurses who are living in our centrally located properties. What we've seen is their income moved from circa 75,000 when they signed up 12 months ago to this year being over $110,000. And that's been as a function of, one, being able to work overtime so they're rested and close to their workplace. Two, the demand on the health system over here at the moment. But being close to their workplace has meant that they've been able to continue to work or work overtime shifts and be refreshed and in a good space to do that work. What it's also meant we've had to do is evaluate the portfolio and evaluate our policy framework, because we're assessing incomes now that sit outside the threshold of what the program was designed to do. With that though, what we do have is a portfolio that will sit in our organisation for at least 20 years. So we have 100 affordable units that will be available to key workers that won't pay more than 30% of their income for the time that they choose to live that in those properties and for the time they're eligible based on income. One of the benefits that the project delivered was that it was immediate supply of housing stock. We didn't have to wait for development projects to be completed. We didn't have to wait to commence pre-approvals, planning, DAs, contract engagement. We're able to drop 100 units into the market within 2 months, which had a really big impact in terms of housing people. What we saw though is when we ran our expression of interest for eligible people, we had 3,500 applications in 4 weeks. So we had to cut the system off. We only had 100 units and we had 3,500 applications. And that goes to the demand profile of the number of people who are eligible for the program, but don't have access to market properties to rent. Every tenant of ours had a story, whether they were walking to properties in Perth where the rental vacancy rate was sub 1%. They were experiencing being declined for their properties. People were bidding and paying more for their properties. There are all these stories that came through, and some of the more profound stories have been some of the women who have moved into our properties who have said, it's just great now that I drive my car into the car park, I go up to my floor, which I have a fob access, I open that big door, which is a fire-rated security door, and that's the only entrance into my 18-story unit, and I feel safe. I feel I have a much better life as a result of this. So some of the things that were spoken about in the earlier presentation, we're receiving that feedback year into the program, which has been quite profound for the organisation. One of the things that we're really very, very firm on was making sure the properties are in well-located areas. So whilst we did acquire some stock that was outside the city metro area, and I'll use our Joondalup precinct for an example, where there was a great development that being completed there. While that's 25 kilometres outside of the Perth metro area, it's directly across the road from the WA Police Academy and directly across the road from Joondalup Health Campus, and located in a rather large retail precinct. So we knew that there would be demand for those units in that area, and we were proven right with those filling very quickly. And similarly at Cannington and Natwell, where they're located near big health precincts, our units there moved, they were very well received, and our Subiaco Metro City properties all worked very well. All the properties we acquired come with really great amenities. So there's swimming pools, gyms, and again, that was really important, barbecue areas, so that the people who are living there have access to the equal amenities that the people who are owners of those buildings, owner-occupiers, get to share the same benefits with them. So we've tried to provide a really good amenity that covers a broad range of needs for the people who are living there. One of the things we're seeing over here in WA, and I'm sure it's being replicated across the country, is that retail investors are moving out of the market. So where we're seeing a retail investor, a mum and dad investor selling their investment property, it's being acquired by owner-occupiers. So the rental pool in WA is shrinking quite significantly. Obviously with COVID, we've had some really some negative impacts in terms of supply of trades and materials, which is delaying that building boom that was coming. So there is a real shortage on rental properties in WA at the moment, and a real shortage on affordable rental properties. And in the last 12 months, when we launched the product, our Atwell product, the base entry salary was $45,000. A year later, that's moved by 10,000 to 55. So we're seeing that affordability index increasing that level in the space of 1 year. One of the key selling points for our board was that, and the model that we put together was that we believe we could acquire, with $45 million, we could acquire $55 million worth of stock. So we knew that if we could get the right discounts, get the GST back, and some other statutory concessions, that we would be able to acquire with $55 million worth of stock, hence delivering $10 million worth of equity to our balance sheet that we've just leveraged to do this transaction. We also, in acquiring the properties that were brand new, we acquire properties that are developments that are brand new. We have warranties, we have defect liability periods, and we also have minimal ongoing operating expenses, given that the properties we don't have the responsibility of roofs and gutters and grounds and windows and all those sorts of things that come with maintaining a normal residential property that the majority of our portfolio is structured around. Having demonstrated the viability of this project, our recent valuations had the portfolio valued over $60 million. So we've already had a $15 million capital uplift, equity uplift on our balance sheet as a result of year one of the transaction. Our demand for the product has outstripped supply by, we could have delivered 300 elevates and still not been able to satisfy the demand for the product. We're just in the process now of leasing out another 8 that we've acquired recently, and the demand is that the guys of the teams fielded hundreds and hundreds of inquiries about that product. It's a sustainable model for community housing providers, and I believe that this will become, in the absence of a national framework around how to deliver more social housing. Our community housing agreement that we operate in tandem with the state government provides us the opportunity to move into affordable housing. It's quite clear that we can enter into affordable housing, we can work with institutional investors and the like. I think what's becoming more apparent is that it's also a sustainable investment model for organisations such as ours that have our charitable status and other benefits that we can leverage. But it also delivers a much needed product in the market where there's a gap. And we saw that clear gap from that sort of $40,000 category all the way through to $80,000 to $90,000, where people were isolated or blocked out of the main market, or they weren't obviously eligible for social housing. So there's a real gap, and I think Catherine's research demonstrated that. And I think we'll see more of that, and I think we'll see more providers moving into these sorts of products. We've seen institutional money come into the sector last year when Lighthouse worked with St George on their Sydney project, and I think there'll be a lot more of that when super funds can see that they can invest through sophisticated investors, but then have the support of our sector to make the right acquisitions and have the right management function around how we deliver and support those assets. I believe there'll be a lot more of that coming into the country, and I think it's a great opportunity for us. I mean, when we look at our mission is that we provide affordable housing options for people on low to moderate incomes. So the affordable housing portfolio completely aligns with our mission. It means that we can grow our organisation. It means we can grow our cash flows, and we can use those for a mix of social and affordable products, where if we're sitting idle waiting for government stimulatory measures to try and activate social housing, we could become quite stagnant, where the affordable model works to deliver much better outcomes for those that are in that market. This map here just gives you an overview of that's a map of the portfolio of the properties we acquired. As you can see, the red dots, number one at the top is Joondalup, which is 20 k's out of the Perth area. We bought 8 units in that property, and they were rented very quickly. And moving down to 15, which is our Atwell product, that sits in an education university medical precinct, as does number 12, that Cannington one out to the right. But all the other properties are located within 5 kilometres of the CBD. They're all on the train line. They all have they all had good access to the CBD and those surrounding precincts, whether they be in Subiaco or in some of the more industrial parts of Perth. Number 3, which is our Scarborough property, while that's right on the beach, it still feeds into Osborne Park, which is Osborne and Husbands Park, which has a very big retail, bulky goods in a commercial office space. So that's an overview of the portfolio. Everything we bought was brand new. The oldest property, I think, was 3 years old, and we're almost complete. We're trying to acquire a few more properties now to complete the portfolio, but so we've got 8 settling at the end of this month and a few more at the following month. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Chris. Can we just thank him for such a generous and detailed presentation? I do have a lot of questions, Chris, so I'm going to start. I noted from your presentation that you said 3,500 applications in 3 weeks. One of our delegates is asking, what method did you promote and advertise to garner such a response?
So what we did, we were able to use realestate.com as the advertising vehicle for the property. So we were able to say, once we had settlement of the properties, we're able to put the property up. We advertised it as an affordable housing project, being through Elevate by Foundation Housing, so people knew what that was. And we kept our Foundation Housing name there, so people, if they searched Foundation Housing, they would see who we are. We then would say that here is the application form you have to submit in relation to that particular property. So that outlined people's income, profession, requirements and all those things. And then from there, the team just did a scan of each one and categorised them by where they wanted to live, what their income was, what their profession was, where they were working. And then from there, they were able to run them through a filter and say yes or no, or we'll put you on we'll let you know in due course.
That would answer another question that I have from our audience about eligibility. What definition did you use to determine who was eligible?
Yeah, we set that around income. So that was all set around income. So people had to provide their evidence, their income, that they met the criteria. And we did put that. We were quite clear in our EOI forms on what was required. So I mean, some people still submitted the information that wasn't necessarily compliant, but we tried to make it as clear as possible. And as we went through, we kept changing it week by week or modifying it week by week to get it right. And by the end, I think of week 2, we had a really good system where we weren't seeing too many people making applications that weren't eligible.
And you mentioned in your presentation the positive impact for residents. So positive impact for key workers was their income increasing because they were close to their workplace. They were able to take extra shifts and do additional overtime. There's a question in regard to that. Those incomes that had increased and sat outside that threshold, did they still receive a discount to market rent? How close was their 30% of the income to market rent?
So we try to keep it between sort of 26 to 28%. So we didn't want to push people up that 30% of their income. And what we've done is we've pegged that it's between 20 and 30%. So we won't have someone earning $150,000 a year and paying 10% of their income on rent. So we tried to have that range between 20 and 30. In connection to those examples I used before about the nurses, obviously their percentage of income they're paying on rent has come down significantly because their income's gone up. But what we did, we took the view that right at the moment in Perth, there's a big issue in relation to there's a huge strain on the health system. So we said, if we're helping the health system, and those tenants of ours are able to put back into the community and support the community, we just kept it to their base salary for those. So for the purpose of their income assessment for this particular year, we just kept it to their base salary, noting that it was, I guess, an unintended consequence that we thought this would happen, and now it has happened as a result of people saying, I don't have to drive an hour and a half home, which I used to have to do. And we've had people say they used to live in Ellenbrook in different areas, so they had long commutes. They couldn't do those shifts. Now they're living close and they can rest and they're 5 minutes from work or from home. They can go home, rest, use the amenity that's in the building, and then go back to work and do those overtime shifts.
And there's another comment, I guess, from our audience in regard to that variability of casual shifts shifts being picked up on top of normal shifts and how income changes and how you've been so nimble to address that challenge as well.
Yeah, these people, those particular tenants are full-time employees with a salary, so they're not casuals, and they're full-time employees who are then working overtime shifts and getting that increase in their income. So we've worked with them. We're not about to penalise people you can't work the overtime because it's going to push your income over the limit and push you out of the eligibility for the portfolio when you're still a key worker by definition, and it's just a consequence of having the opportunity to take those overtime shifts in a market when people have been able to get into the state to support or backfill those. We've been somewhat pragmatic and flexible through that process this year.
Catherine's raised a really interesting point with me about the demographic of your key workers. Are you able to comment, Chris, with regard to that question?
Yeah, look, we've got a lot of nurses, we've got teachers, we have some emergency services workers, so we've got firemen, we've got some firefighters, we've got ambulance workers, we have support workers, so people who work for Anglicare and the like, who provide support to people who in those sorts of areas. So it's quite a broad mix of what we have across that portfolio, but it's worked very well.
I'm just going to shift the direction of the question slightly. How did you determine the location of your properties as appropriate for key workers?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We had a really clear filter. We ran the property. So we developed a matrix assessment for how we would determine where we wouldn't go. So we're as an organisation, we always refer to our tenants as the beacon on the hill, and we want to make sure that we're providing accommodation that meets people's needs and is well located. And Elevate was no different with that. So we had opportunity to acquire some stock that was in pretty poor location for a really good price. We chose not to because it was about making sure people had access to the services that they would want to work at. So in Joondalup, for example, there was a police academy and a big health campus across the road from where this building was. So we knew that there would be a demand for that product in that location. And similarly around the metro areas were required, if it wasn't in the city, it had to be close to a bus route or a train line, or within in almost riding distance of your push bike, 5 kilometres to the city if that's where you're going to work. Similarly, our Subiaco product was located next to the St John of God Health Campus and all the facilities around there. So it was about making sure that the buildings that we're acquiring, one, were built by reputable builders and good developers. 2, we could get the right price for them, and 3, they were in a really good location that would service the needs of those tenants who would be living in there.
And was the property acquisition only viable when the market is less heated and less demand driven?
It certainly benefited us, but we're a bit different now. We wanted to hold the properties for at least 20 years. So for us, it was about a long-term, having those properties in the system for longer than 10 years. So we've seen what's happened with NRAS in 10 years and the pressure that puts on. So we wanted to be a holder of assets for longer. And we estimate that at the end of the 20-year period, we will have at least 60% equity in that portfolio. And if we need to, we can divest some of that portfolio to retire the balance of the debt. It still works though, if you can, in the way that we structure out those investments with clawing back the GST and other statutory concessions, there's still opportunity with developers if you take a wholesale transaction to get a discount. So if you can get your 10% GST back, you can claw back a 5 to 7, 8% discount on the retail listing price of the transaction. It does work.
And of course the question, do you expect the market to shift once the WA border opens? Do you have a crystal ball?
Oh, WA, we're seeing it now. There's not enough housing in WA right now. So it's going to be a real issue. As I said, we could have bought 300 units and they'd all be full right now. We still have a big wait list. And we're seeing that with our social housing wait list, where Our vacancy rate this year will be the lowest it's ever been. Our turnover rate in properties will be the lowest it's ever been. I think we'll track at about 50 for the year, and we normally average 100 in the turnover rate. So people aren't leaving their homes that have social or affordable properties where they've got good landlords.
We have time for one more question, but I will keep these questions for the end of our session as well. How much of the $45 million was financed by Nifik, and who financed the remainder? Nifik
fully funded the whole project. We made a small contribution, but Nifik effectively funded the whole project. There was no government support or funding for this project.
Thank you so much, Chris, for such a wonderful presentation and a really meaty Q&A session. Very grateful to you. Would you please join me in thanking Chris?
And now I'd like to welcome Tim to the lectern.
We're just going to cue the videotape.
If COVID, bushfires and floods has taught us one thing, it's how important our essential workers are. They're the everyday heroes we all love and need, especially in our big cities. So when it comes to home ownership, why does the door get slammed in their face? Soaring house prices have locked out a generation from the great Australian dream. This is especially true for essential workers. Increasingly, they can't afford to buy near their place of work, and they can't work from home, so they commute hours to the city or squeeze into rental accommodation, which is so expensive they stop saving for a deposit. It's exhausting, it's stressful, and some essential workers even quit their job. But it doesn't have to be this way. Introducing Hope Housing. We're a not-for-profit shared equity fund manager. Our mission is to make home ownership achievable for essential workers, like police, nurses, ambos, fireys, and teachers. Here's how it works. The worker finds a home to buy. They get a mortgage to fund their share of the purchase price. Hope funds the rest by co-investing as a silent partner, and the worker moves into their new home, closer to work. There are no ongoing payments required on Hope Share. Hope gets paid when the property is sold, and we also receive a share of any capital growth. For the essential worker, it means they can own a home sooner, live closer to work, experience less financial stress, and keep working in the job they love. We call it Home Ownership Help for Everyday Heroes.
Okay. Hello, I'm Tim Buskins, and let me start by thanking AHURI for this opportunity to come in and present to you, and also acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to those elders, well, those owners and the elders of past, present and emerging.
If COVID, bushfire.
It was always going to be a risk putting a video in a presentation, wasn't it? You know, you like to get smooth. You know, I'll let the guys at the back control that. Let me just start. I guess first point is the Hope journey. We started in 2017. Or the late 2017, and it really started with myself and my business partner Tim Sims getting together and talking about problems that we were really keen to solve. And where we sort of landed was a real deep concern for the communities in which we live. It's a community problem that we started off with, and in discussing that problem, we got and became really concerned about the fact that those communities in which we live are weakening. And in particular, those people that we rely on so much are leaving, those essential workers, key workers. I think I added another terminology, everyday heroes. But this is the problem that we started with. And both Tim and I, we come out of not from a housing industry, not from a not-for-profit industry or a community housing provider. We come out of investment, superannuation, private equity. We're finance guys. And, as finance guys, we're really bullish that, yes, we can solve that problem, utilising our collective understanding. But we hadn't really had a clue on how to solve that problem. So it fell to me, because Tim's got a day job running one of the most successful private equity firms, it fell to me to take up the mantle and really think deeply about it. Undertaking research, looking at the various models that existed here and overseas, we did land on shared equity as a solution. And I do acknowledge, the leadership already on shared equity. It's in Australia with Homes Vic and Keystart in WA and Homestart in South Australia. State governments have led the charge. So we're not innovating around shared equity, and there is obviously examples of it in the UK predominantly and a little bit in the US. So we sort of landed on that, and the reason why we landed on that is because we're financing guys, we wanted to ensure that what we could deliver was a commercial and scalable solution to really attract institutional capital, and also get a solution that could balance the needs of the homeowner. We want to ensure that we can give them the head start. We don't actually want them to rely on us. We want them to utilise us to start, get rid of us and get on the ladder on their own. So shared equity, we looked at that, at the product. We softened some of the hard edges of the models out there. We evolved that product to meet needs for the key worker cohort, and I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. We then started thinking around, okay, well, again, going back to scale and the importance of delivery. How do we get it into the hands of key workers? We have and continue to have union connections and to be able to raise awareness. But what was important to us, and again borrowing off the leadership of our state governments I mentioned, was to distribute it through an existing, regulated, robust framework, which is the commercial bank network. This is a solution that sits alongside a mortgage. But like we did with the product itself, we wanted to ensure that we looked at the banking model and evolved it to meet the needs, again, of the balance between investors and those people that are actually benefiting the key workers. And we made some changes there, and I'll go through that shortly as well. Then centred to this whole thing was the point, we're here to solve a problem. Housing affordability, we have conferences built around it. There's a huge amount of dialogue developed around it. We've got excellent research on it. But I wanted to ensure that I could put some money where the mouth was and start with what is the social model that we're actually trying to achieve here. We used and worked a lot with the Centre of Social Impact, and from an academic perspective, we developed our theory of change, which in layman's terms is we identified the change that we actually want to see in the community, and then we built around that change we want to see, the measures, the areas, the long-term, short-term, and medium-term goals. And there's going to be three really cool things that come out of that. One, obviously, from an investment perspective, and impact and social is hot at the moment, and people really need and look to access that, and so they should. But two, we actually don't know everything, and I'm sure that there's stuff we will learn through engaging those key workers that we help move closer to their work, about the product features, about the things that they need, that we can evolve ourselves in different areas and different spaces, and even different cohorts of people. But three, and I'm glad that sort of Catherine raised it, what we are doing here is going to be a longitudinal research study of the impact for key workers in our community living closer to work. last 2 points up there, that's really where our bread and butter came from. That was probably one of the easiest things to do for us. We worked with Deloitte. We came through, have a financing model. We know how to set up trust structures, wholesale investment vehicles. We can talk investment jargon till the cows come home, and I can get really excited about that. But I won't bore you with it here. Happy to, if anyone wants to ping me after this conference and go through the detail, happy to do that. But that's bread and butter. But what we found in doing that, and it came up in a session that I attended earlier with the build to rent guys in the think tank. One of the things we thought naively, this is going to be pretty easy. We'll be up and running in a couple of years. But setting up, being a first-time fund manager is difficult to do. Being a first-time fund manager with a product that doesn't really have a sort of a private, as I said, there's government product out there, but it doesn't have a private driven focus that people don't understand. It's difficult to get engagement around. Having a first-time fund with a new product in an asset class, residential property, 9 trillion, biggest asset class, institutional investors aren't exposed to it. How does that fit? Where do I put it? What bucket do I put that in? Can we talk about that? So there's challenges in there, which is partly the reason why it's given us 4 years to get to where we are. Just a bit about the mechanics. And again, what I've said is I've taken the leadership of the state governments and around the world and taken off some of those hard edges, softened some of the edges. The product itself, as you saw from the video, we are participating as an equity owner, pure equity owner, sharing in the capital growth. We're not charging rent. We're not asking for fees. We want to ensure that we're a true partner with them. We encourage people to renovate. We encourage people to buy us out. We encourage people that they don't have to buy us out. There is a prospect that somebody that we can help next month will be along our journey for 40 years, and that's okay. We want to ensure there's affordability. We understand some of the challenges, and we've heard the metric of 30%. That's a piece, and that's one of the banking pieces that I mentioned of. For a bank to distribute hope, and we have our first partnership arrangement sealed late last year, Mutual Bank and Sydney Police Bank. For them to distribute hope, they've got to wrap their heads around the simple point that we've asked them to do is lend less. And you usually get a bit of from a banker, you want me to lend less? Yes. So in the hope arrangement, they'll go through a normal credit assessment for that worker, as they do according to their APRA guidelines. But we are ensuring that the mortgage that sits under a hope solution will be less than what they will get in the open market. 30% is pretty important to us. That is a criteria that servicing can't be more than 30% of their mortgage. But there are two other key issues here, or key changes that we've negotiated with the bank and every banking partner. Mortgages are traditionally 30 years, and this mortgage can be 30 years, but the principal payment is 20. So what's happening? The key worker is getting a smaller mortgage within 30% of their household income, and they're paying it off quicker. And the third, which comes down, will come down probably on the other page, but the other key point is with the bank is, guys, you're helping them buy half the home. We're not on title. It's not tenants in common. The legal structures aren't us being there. We've got a registered charge, but we're equity and we've got that 50%. And bank, you don't have any recourse over that amount, pari passu. The bank has recourse over the homeowner's component, which is fair and equitable, but no recourse. And that's a really important aspect from an investment perspective, because it just changes some of that risk dynamic. So I thought I'd just show you a little bit of a forward-looking view, so what the model can do. What was really important, really focusing in on, is helping people get in, and I mentioned at the first, helping people get in, but giving them the opportunity to build their equity so they don't need us. So they've got that sense of ownership, they've got the decisions around to sell, but they've got the mechanics in the product that really supercharges an investment. And we heard it this morning. Next to, superannuation is an important investment for people's retirements, but housing, ownership of housing, equity in housing is so critical and makes all the difference. And what we're doing here is ensuring that we're giving people access to that ladder in a way that gets them there, and eventually they won't need us at all. So this is just a worked example. $1 million, what the homeowner's equity, what the bank's equity under the current conditions. The underlying assumption here, as I mentioned about that 20-year payoff period, the underlying assumption here is all those extra payments that's going into this offset, they're just throwing onto their mortgage. But they've got the option. They can, and we can vary this scenario where they can say, well, no, actually, I'm a bit more bullish on the housing market. I'm happy to keep the mortgage at a 30-year, and any additional payments I've put onto the hope. Great for us. Gets them equity, gives us and the investors additional liquidity, additional to what they're normally getting through the sales profiles of these homes. But it's still giving them the result of building that equity up. And there's no inheritance here. There's no assumed I'm going to get a greater level of pay. This model is based on doing nothing more than setting up the arrangement and forgetting about it. So where are we? 4 years down. Some great and productive discussions with investors, governments, academics, people like yourselves in this space that have a passion, and it's great coming into this industry, meeting and starting to recognise faces. It's a great industry to be in. We have from the end of this last year, we've got 60 million of commitments. That's a start. Raising our first fund will be 400 million, so we've still got some time, so we've got a way to go. So a big focus of myself is still on that investment fundraise. But 60 million is enough to get us started. We're going to start small. We've got the operational piece set up. If someone walked into Police Bank tomorrow, we can start the engagement in the process with them. We've got the funding. It'll take them, probably a month or so for the various bank approval processes. Then a bit of time to find a home, but we can start that process today. The arrangements with the bank, as I mentioned, and what you're seeing here with the bank is set up. We've got those pieces in place. We've got the agreed terms with the LMI insurers, QBE, because clearly understanding of being a pari passu, the bank is still effectively writing a 95% LVR. They do that now, and they'll continue to do that in the future, and they've accepted and understand that, and QBE are very much on board. And we have those mortgage rules set in place. So it has been a journey. It has been a combination of drawing the best from a lot of different sectors, connecting it all together, weaving it all together, transforming what we want and what we needed to transform to meet those needs of those essential workers, the people in our community that we need, that we know, that we love, connected, transformed. And through getting them onto the ladder and enabling them to build the equity, we're developing that resistance for them, for their family, for their community. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that incredibly inspiring presentation. There are a lot of really wonderful questions coming from our audience again. Thank you. And I'm wondering, Corey, can we welcome Chris back into the room virtually so that we can include him in this conversation as well, if that's possible? So, Tim, to you directly, a very practical, feeling like a very stark question. What happens if a household's income fails?
Fails as in, so they default on their loan? Well, what will happen is what happens today. The bank, through the regulatory process, will have to go through a hardship process. There's very strict rules around hardship. I think from memory, I think there's a 6 to 12 month process the banks will take them through according to APRA guidance. But what's important to us is, as partners and supporting that key worker, if the bank can't get them back onto track, and they'll do everything they can too, we've got the option as equity participants to stand in there and say, well, you are a key worker about our community. We're about strengthening communities. What can we do to help you? This is an addition thing that doesn't happen. And we can, with our equity piece, start funding or start supporting to a point in time that that's needed for that worker. And of course, there's obviously going to be a capital adjustment to that, fair and reasonable, but we'll give that additional support. But what's really important is there's things that happen today in the marketplace, and our solution's always looking at, well, where they're appropriate, they should continue to happen. We don't want to disrupt those hardship processes, but we want to be able to be there to provide additional support if need be.
Well, welcome, Chris. We see you there on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can Hope operate across Australia, Tim?
Yes. So our pilot, we are Sydney-based. Our pilot will start in the Sydney metropolitan area. We're very keen to come to Melbourne. Very keen. My hometown, my parents live in Bacchus Marsh, so I call Melbourne my hometown. Very keen, and the problem is here. I'd love to go up the eastern seaboard to Brisbane and any other state that wants us. So, but the model is scalable, and it's not impeded by geographic borders.
Can I draw all of our speakers into this conversation now about international models? You've obviously scanned the marketplace, the horizon. Can we speak about those, please?
You want me to start?
Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question. Shared equity. I guess when I started approaching it, and I don't want to sound disparaging to the government employees in the room, I used to work with Victorian Treasury, so I sort of, this was 20 years ago. But when dealing with government, careful what you wish for. And I was really keen to look at the models, across, and I could see that there was this shared equity model which is kind of appealing, but we're all largely reliant on a government piece. And so a lot of our work was to remove that reliability, that reliance. Now, I always welcome government help, I say, but I'm keen to ensure that to scale this, we can do it without government. So I guess that was a point that, with models I've seen, they're all very good, but the government piece is the one that you've got to sort of solve for.
I don't know much to add except that there are examples of very long-standing, shared ownership programs and shared equity programs, and capital grants and loans made available to developers who build workforce housing or affordable housing for workers. So those models do exist. One thing that's really supported a supply of affordable homes in the UK that are put towards shared ownership programs is there is a planning requirement for that. So the planning system plays a really key role in delivering a supply of units through similar to an inclusionary zoning type scheme. So, I mean, I think there is scope as well to use the planning system better to deliver a relatively consistent supply of homes that could potentially then be accessed by key workers through some shared ownership or shared equity models.
Chris, would you like to join the conversation on that point?
Thanks, Jen. Look, I don't have a lot to offer in terms of the international landscape. We took the view of what was required in WA at the time, so we didn't lean too much on the international research in our decision-making for our project.
Thank you. So, Tim, I have a question directly for you. Is the HOPE model vulnerable if property prices fall?
Well, the HOPE model does rely and has an underlying assumption that property prices over a long term will continue to grow. We partnered very early on with BIS Oxford Economics, and we looked at 40 years of back data, and we've been working with them for the last 4 years on forecasting out 10 to 15 years. So we've got sort of private research around that, because you don't get that sort of stuff in the market. What that long term, you always hear the next 12 months. BIS Oxford Economics are assuming somewhere between 4 to 6% is their long-term growth forecast, averaging across units and houses. But obviously, as we all inherently know, different property types in different locations, there are very many markets. They all will behave differently. I think the long-term 40-year data shows that over a long-term period, and by long term I'm talking sort of 7 to 10 years, average properties are sort of around that 6 to 7%, but that's what the historical model's saying. We haven't in our history, over wars and recession and fundamental changes in our market, structural changes in the market, never had a long-term negative amount. And if we did see in the future a long-term negative amount, I think Hope Housing Fund will be the least of anyone's worry. We would have serious meltdown in the market if the Australian residential property was negative. But it is a driver of the return, and we can't get away from that.
If I may, we're coming to our closing 3 or so minutes. Can I offer the floor to our speakers again for a very brief closing comment, and then I'll wrap our session up for the day?
Sure. So I'm really, really excited by everyone's interest today, but also in hearing about these two models. So what we heard in our research speaking to the key worker industry representatives is that both affordable rental housing and ownership opportunities are extremely important. Rental properties in particular for key workers' ability to take up new jobs, to take up new assignments, to access housing when, for example, for a police officer, if they're given their first assignment, they've been studying, they may not have, a deposit, they may not have an income history to show. So it's really, really helpful in accessing housing in proximity to work. But to retain key workers in expensive inner subregions over the long term, there need to be ownership opportunities, because that continues to be a very strong aspiration. And some of the people we spoke to even talked about home ownership as being seen as almost a reward for doing a job that's very intense, that can be very stressful, that can be very exhausting. So I'm really, really excited to see both of these models developing.
Chris, would you like to?
Yeah, I'll just close by saying we received a DA last week on a project in a suburb called Como in Perth, which is a really nice suburb for 120 units. And our objective will be to get as many affordable housing units into that particular project. The City of South Perth acknowledged that area just doesn't have any affordable housing there right now. And going forward, it'll become out of reach for most people in that affordable bracket. So for us, it's just about building more affordable housing, as we can see, and putting people in really good locations so they can live and work in the suburbs that they're residing, as opposed to, as we've heard today, being forced out or living in very crowded accommodation.
I guess when we started in 2017, there was no COVID. There wasn't a word. The 1 in 100 year floods hadn't really occurred up in Sydney right now. We always live with bushfires, but you recall that back end of 2019 when there was raging fires, I'm excited to actually be now part of an industry and being able to deliver a solution, just one of the many great solutions out there. Engage with this industry, look at how we can evolve it, scale it, get it up and going, and helping those people that we really, really need as part of our community.
And if I may, what has struck me today from all of our presenters is the importance of an affordable, safe and secure home. Chris, you said that one of your people mentioned a better life as a result of this housing. So on that super positive note, I'd like to thank our presenters again today, Catherine, Chris and Tim, also Homes Victoria, our conference partner, and for you being here and in person, online. Before you leave today, if you have the time, could you please complete our short survey for this session? Thank you so much.